Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are diving headfirst into the fascinating historical, symbolic, and theological realities hidden behind the infamous Mark of the Beast. Look, it's a concept that has captivated and, let's be honest, completely terrified people for centuries, sparking just an endless amount of theories and debates. But instead of getting lost in all the speculation, we're going to look directly at the historical context, the original texts, and the major frameworks scholars use to understand exactly what the Apostle John was describing in the book of Revelation.
So let's start with what most of us have seen on television or in movies. You know the tropes, right? We often encounter these literal pop culture fears, which are heavily tied to the futurist perspective of biblical prophecy. People have theorized for decades that the mark of the beast might be a physical barcode, a mandated debit card, or even a microchip implanted right in your skin that you literally need just to go buy groceries. But when we look purely at these modern technological anxieties, we really have to ask, is there a much deeper historical and symbolic meaning to the text that we're just completely missing?
To actually crack the code of Revelation, we first have to wrap our heads around the genre it was written in, which is apocalyptic literature. To a first-century audience, this wasn't some futuristic secret code, not at all. It was a well-understood way to express the immense trauma and persecution they were currently facing. Think of it kind of like a modern political cartoon. If you open a newspaper and see a drawing of a red elephant fighting a blue donkey, you don't expect literal mutant animals to go destroy Washington, right? You instantly recognize the symbols. Well, God was using familiar, highly vivid imagery to deliver a message of hope to early Christians who were suffering under the Roman Empire.
Which brings us right into identifying the beasts.
In Revelation 13, John introduces not one but two terrifying beasts that work together to oppress the masses. First up, we have the sea beast. Drawing directly from the imagery of the four animals in the book of Daniel, this composite empire is wild. It has the mouth of a lion, the feet of a bear, and looks like a leopard, complete with 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, preterist scholars, who view these prophecies as being fulfilled back in the 1st century, identify this sea beast as the oppressive Roman Empire. Specifically, they point to emperors like Nero or Domitian, who actually demanded to be worshipped as living gods, persecuted Christians, and seemingly survived a fatal wound, which perfectly echoes a historical myth at the time that Nero would actually return from the dead.
Right alongside that, we have the earth beast, which essentially acts as the enforcer, often called the false prophet. It looks harmless enough, like a gentle lamb with 2 horns, but it speaks with the terrifying voice of a dragon. Historically speaking, this represents the provincial priests in Asia Minor who enforced the imperial cult. Through severe coercion and deceptive signs, they literally forced citizens to publicly worship the emperor, the sea beast, or face some really dire consequences.
And that leads us to the big one. Calculating the number 666.
So the Earth Beast enforced loyalty by mandating a specific mark on the right hand or forehead, ensuring that nobody could buy or sell anything without it. And then John issues a direct challenge to his readers: calculate the number of the beast. Now, to understand how to even do that, we have to look at an ancient Jewish cultural practice known as gematria. Imagine living in a world before our modern numbering systems, where your alphabet was also your calculator. Every single letter also functioned as a number, meaning every word or name had a numerical identity attached to it. By using this ancient cipher, what seems like a terrifying, mystical number suddenly transforms into a highly specific historical clue.
Here is exactly how that calculation works. When you take the Greek spelling of Nero Caesar, the Roman emperor who fiercely and brutally persecuted early Christians, and you transliterate it into Hebrew letters as Neron Caesar, you get a specific set of values. Add up the numerical equivalents for those letters, 50, 200, 6, 50, 100, 60, and 200, and the total comes out to exactly 666. It's wild, right? For John's original audience, the identity of the beast was unmistakably clear.
But wait, here is where it gets incredibly fascinating. Some of the oldest preserved biblical manuscripts, like Papyrus 115, actually record the number of the beast as 616 rather than 666. So is this just a typo? Not at all. If you take the Latin spelling of Nero Caesar instead of the Greek and translate that into Hebrew, the letters add up precisely to 616. This historical variant is amazing because it beautifully proves that regardless of the regional spelling, the beast's historical identity as Emperor Nero remains entirely consistent.
Let's shift gears and look at the literal versus symbolic interpretation of the mark on the hand and forehead. This is absolutely crucial to understanding the debate. As we mentioned earlier, futurists often look for literal physical marks.
They interpret the text to mean a future dictator is going to mandate a literal tattoo or some kind of technological implant required for all economic transactions. However, the idealist and historicist perspectives heavily favor a symbolic interpretation. In biblical literature, the forehead universally symbolizes a person's inner beliefs, their mind, and their intellect. The right hand represents a person's actions, works, and labor. Therefore, receiving the mark isn't about a physical barcode, it means giving your mind and your actions over to a system opposed to God.
And this symbolic view connects directly back to the Hebrew Scriptures. In Deuteronomy, God commands his people to bind his laws to their hands and foreheads as a sign of their devotion, a practice Jewish believers literally observe by wearing small boxes called phylacteries. So the mark of the beast is actually a direct, blasphemous parody of this. The beast isn't necessarily inventing a new physical brand, rather it's demanding the ultimate allegiance of your thoughts and your deeds, directly trying to replace the space that's supposed to be reserved for God.
So, let's talk about what this means as a sign of obedience.
This brings us to a really specific theological framework championed by historicists, particularly groups like the Seventh-day Adventists. In this perspective, the mark of the beast fundamentally represents rejecting God's law to comply with a false religious system or state power. Basically, it means compromising your faith just to ensure your own economic survival. On the exact opposite side of that coin, the true sign of God is defined by complete obedience to his commandments. Within this framework, observing the Sabbath functions as that ultimate visible sign of loyalty and allegiance to the Creator.
The reason the Sabbath is viewed this way is deeply rooted in the fourth commandment. The Sabbath inherently dictates when a person can labor, because observing it directly halts your ability to work, earn a living, or transact business on the seventh day. It perfectly mirrors the economic restrictions imposed by the mark of the beast. In this view, when the state says, "Work and trade my way," taking the financial hit to keep the Sabbath holy requires immense faith. It clearly separates those who obey God from those who just conform to the beast to get by.
Taking a broader look beyond just the first century or specific denominations, we find the idealist perspective. Championed by historical heavyweights like St. Augustine, this view doesn't tie the beast to just one emperor like Nero or even one specific future dictator. Instead, the beast represents any ungodly system, any toxic ideology, or oppressive state throughout human history that sets itself up in opposition to the faithful, demanding the total unyielding allegiance of our minds and our hands. So, to wrap up this explainer, we're really left with a powerful historical and personal challenge. The original text wasn't written to make early Christians panic about future technology. It was a call for endurance in the face of immense cultural pressure. So, instead of looking around for literal barcodes, microchips, or waiting for some sci-fi villain to appear, the text is asking us to look inward. When you face modern economic pressures, political tribalism, and shifting cultural demands, whose mark are your beliefs and your daily actions demonstrating today?